Hello, and welcome to the DuckerFrontier webinar, Rising U.S.-China Tensions and the Future of Hong Kong. Before we get started, we realize that some of you may be new to our company, so we'd like to take a minute to provide you with a very quick overview of our firm and how we work with executives at major multinationals. DuckerFrontier is a leading market intelligence and consulting firm that provides tailored solutions to drive growth for clients across the consumer, B2B, healthcare, and technology sectors. Our dedicated team serves as advisors to clients, delivering the market and industry knowledge they need to succeed at all points in the business cycle. With continuous research and insights, custom solutions, and transaction support services, we provide our clients, a small sample of which you can see here, with timely, actionable insights to adapt and win in changing markets. Our company is headquartered in Washington, D.C., with offices in Troy, Michigan, New York, London, Paris, Berlin, Singapore, Shanghai, and Bangalore. As part of our offering, we're excited to announce that we have recently launched a new mobile app. Frontier View Mobile, which is available for both iOS and Android, includes all the relevant content you need to monitor markets, inform strategic planning, and power key decisions in your critical markets. Having briefly introduced our company, I'd like to take a moment to briefly introduce myself. My name is Adam Jarzik, and I'm the head of research for Asia Pacific at DuckerFrontier. As the leader of DuckerFrontier's APAC research team, I support senior executives on key initiatives, including strategic planning, resource allocation, and risk management, among others. Because I'm in constant contact with our clients, I'll be discussing not only the results of our research, but also what we've been hearing from multinationals who have been impacted and are being impacted by the ongoing tensions between the US and China, as well as recent shifts in Hong Kong. If there are any insights that you see today as part of this discussion or any questions we don't get to answer, our client services team, Sarah, Althea, and Yu-Chen, will be happy to follow up with you directly. And with that, I'd like to turn now to the agenda for today's webinar. Our webinar today will consist of a 55-minute presentation followed by Q&A. To be specific, I'll begin the session with a discussion on rising US-China tensions. During that portion of the presentation, we'll discuss why tensions between Washington and Beijing are likely to persist in the medium to long term and what you can expect in terms of US policy post-election. Specifically, we'll outline where we see changes or where we may see changes to the US's China policy under a Biden administration and where we will likely see continuity no matter who wins. We'll also explore what implications a multilateral push under a Biden administration might have for China's competitive landscape. Once we finish that section, we'll spend a little time at the end talking about the future of Hong Kong. Specifically, we'll discuss the new national security law, how it's likely to affect Hong Kong's attractiveness as an international business hub, and what impact it will have on the city's trajectory. Finally, we'll round out the webinar with a Q&A session. So if you have any questions or points of clarification regarding any of the topics we covered today, please don't hesitate to send them to DuckerFrontier webinars via the GoToMeeting messenger by clicking on the Q&A box on the right-hand side of the screen, and we'll do our best to ensure that your questions are addressed in the Q&A period. All right, without further ado, let's get started with a discussion on rising US-China tensions. Tensions between the US and China are rising right now at an accelerated pace. I'm not talking about the two sides trading barbs over COVID-19, although that certainly has not helped the relationship. Now, I'm talking about the fact that the US has taken a series of concrete actions in recent weeks, escalating tensions on several fronts. To be honest, I was surprised by how many actions the US has taken when I started digging into this topic. Many of its new policies have gone underreported because there's so much news in the US about COVID, protests, civil unrest, the election, etc. But if you take a look at the timeline in this slide, which outlines the actions the US has taken over the course of the last 10 weeks, you'll get a sense of this recent acceleration. Now, some of you may be asking yourselves, this is all well and good, but don't we have a US election coming up? I mean, couldn't this just be the Trump administration pushing policies so it can seem like it's taking a hard on China approach and win some votes in November? The answer to that question is actually no. I mean, don't get me wrong, that that certainly will be a dynamic in the upcoming election, but the measures that are listed on this slide have been taken by a variety of different actors in the US government and are tied to longer term processes. So while we may not see new measures come out at quite the same pace moving forward, we should all plan for a continued escalation in tensions because this pace is likely to stay somewhere close to where it is now. Why? Because the US's hardened stance on China is based on a strong bipartisan consensus. You know, the Republicans and the Democrats in the US don't agree on much these days. But when it comes to China, they tend to see eye to eye. It's one place where you actually do see some degree of alignment. Take a look at the charts on this slide. On the left-hand side, you see, these are both opinion polls in the US about China. On the left, you'll see a comparison of people who said they have a favorable versus unfavorable opinion of China. You'll note that negative views in the US on China have increased quite markedly since the US-China trade war began, and they have jumped even more following the COVID-19 outbreak. If you take a look at the chart on the right, you'll see that it doesn't really matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat on this one. Yes, Republicans do hold a more negative view than Democrats in aggregate, but a majority in both parties hold unfavorable views on China. The bottom line here is that the general direction of US-China relations is clear. It's not going in a positive direction. But in this case, while the direction is clear, the details are not, and the devil's in the details, because while the Republicans and the Democrats see eye to eye on a lot of things, they don't see eye to eye on everything. So I'd like to spend some time now talking about the US election because it has the potential to change some key aspects of this relationship and the broader business environment. Now, if we look at the polls for the upcoming US presidential election, Biden appears to be in a very favorable position. He's held a stable, consistent lead in the polls, reflecting, at least in part, voter concern over the COVID-19 crisis and a negative view on the Trump administration's policy response. You can see that if you take a look at the chart here. This is drawn from 538, which is a prominent research organization. Does actually research in a variety of areas, but one place where it's very well known is on US elections. They've taken US presidential polls from a variety of different organizations and plotted them out here. And what you'll note is that by and large, over time, Biden has maintained a very consistent lead. But it's important to acknowledge that although Biden's currently leading the US presidential race, his victory is by no means assured. The debates haven't even started yet, and past presidential elections have swung dramatically in the weeks leading up to the polls. So when we look at the US elections, it's very important that we use scenario analysis. Now, we actually have an entire research report that outlines potential outcomes for the upcoming US elections. Not just the presidential elections, I should note, but the legislative elections, which are critically important for anybody who is looking at US tax policy or just US domestic policy in general. But we don't have a whole lot of time to dig into that here and now. So we've basically tried to boil down our view on the US elections into a single slide. I'm not going to go through the narratives and all the drivers, but here's the gist of it. What we've laid out here is the fact that there are some underlying fundamental drivers behind the election. The COVID case count, the level of COVID infections is one, the health of the economy is a second, and social unrest and the degree to which it continues to play into the broader narrative in the election. These are three things that could still move between now and the election. We believe that these three things are going to heavily influence the outcome. Taking all of that together, looking at the trends, looking at where we expect them to move going forward, we currently believe that there's a 70% chance of a Biden victory. And we'll come back to this in a bit, but having spoken about the US election at a high level, let's go ahead and dive into the details because that's really where the rubber hits the road. It shouldn't come as too much of a surprise that if Mr. Trump is reelected, we expect to see a continuation of the policies from his first term. For anyone who objects to this view, incidentally, I'd point you to the Republican Party platform for this year. Instead of drawing up a new platform for 2020, the RNC, the Republican National Committee, basically opted to just adopt the same platform it used in 2016. The only addition that was made came from Mr. Trump, who released a 2-page memo with a series of bullet points. So basically, the Republicans have decided to let Trump be Trump. Mr. Biden, on the other hand, is a little bit different. He has exhibited some marked differences, or his policy priorities look a little bit different than what we've seen within the certainly the left wing of the DNC, and look very different from what we saw in many cases during the Obama administration. So, so the big questions in the election on U.S.-China relations really do revolve around his policy priorities. Having done the analysis, which we'll take you through in detail, we believe his election would lead to changes in some, but not all, of the U.S.'s policy stances on China. You can see that if you look on this slide. So basically what we've done here is we've tried to take selected features of U.S. policymaking under the two different potential administrations, and filtered them out. So there's a very strong focus on China. There are plenty of differences, incidentally, between there would be plenty of differences between the second Trump administration and Biden administration, particularly with regards to domestic policy. But with regards to U.S. policy, there's actually a lot more overlap than not. I could not figure out for the life of me how to fit all of those items into the overlap between the two circles of the Venn diagram here. So this is what I came up with. Basically, in red, you see the features of a Trump administration that would differ from the features of a Biden administration, or the policymaking. Biden administration's policymaking towards China is there on the right. And then the box at the bottom are all the things or all the items where there's overlap between the two sides, right? You'll note their defense of Taiwan's off to the right. Big question mark there. Haven't heard too much from either side on that front. It's an important question mark, admittedly, but we're going to put that aside because we don't have a great deal of visibility into that yet. Instead, what we want to do is we want to talk about areas where we do have visibility and dig into the policies in some depth. Let's begin with the areas in which there's divergence between Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden. All right, there's a lot of text here. Naturally, when you start doing policy analysis, there tends to be a lot of text. Let me lay out what I've done here. Basically, I've taken those three items where there are differences between potential second Trump administration and potential Biden administration, and I've laid out what the U.S. policies tended to look like under Trump in the leftmost column, and then going to the right, laid out how those policies would likely shift under Biden, how China would probably respond to that shift, and what the shift would mean, or what those changes would mean for businesses, all the way there on the right-hand side of the table. Once again, I'm not going to read through all the text. You can take a look at it later. Instead, I'd like to highlight two critical points. Point number one, it's important that companies not become complacent about tariffs. That's because the risk of additional tariffs between the US and China tilts towards the downside. Why do we say that? Well, I mentioned before that we currently assign Biden a 70% chance and Mr. Trump a 30% chance of winning the US election. If Mr. Biden wins, we do not expect him to lower the US's current tariffs on China. I mean, I've talked about it, talked about reviewing it, but from our perspective, the chances of them actually doing anything on that front is pretty small. If Biden lowers those tariffs, he owns those tariffs. If he leaves them alone, he can continue blaming Trump for them. So the political upside of him dropping the tariffs is actually pretty small. If Trump wins, there's a distinct possibility that tariffs will rise further. I mean, the phase one deal is not going to hold. There's little, if any, chance that China is going to meet the targets that it agreed to. You can have a discussion on why that is, whether it's due to the fact that prices are dropping or due to the fact that China just isn't buying enough product. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, right? They're falling way behind the levels they would need to hit to meet their targets. And without that phase one deal, and without any movement on other fronts, Mr. Trump is probably going to raise tariffs further. So, in other words, once again, 70% chance of Biden victory and tariffs not moving, 30% of Trump's 30% chance of a Trump victory and tariffs going up. The probability that tariffs will rise further is greater than the probability that they will fall. Point number 2. Biden will likely try to be more multilateral in his approach than Trump. And that's important because it has the potential to change the competitive landscape for US businesses in China. Now, this is a little bit of a complex topic, and we can't really jump to any conclusions about what will happen yet, because when it comes to China, the outcome of any multilateral push by the Biden administration will ultimately depend very heavily on the EU, and it's not clear whether Europe will play ball. All right, I made a lot of jumps in logic there to get to where we're going, so let me break this down. Let me explain. There are a lot of areas where companies based in the US and the EU and in many other parts of the world would like to see China reform its business environment. For example, stopping forced technology transfers, leveling the playing field for multinationals, removing subsidies for Chinese state-owned enterprises. China doesn't want to do any of these things. It's reticent to make any of these changes because they're not aligned with its long-term economic development strategy. Nevertheless, it would be much more likely to consider some of those changes and perhaps even implement some of them if it faced a united front. In other words, if the US, the EU, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and other countries came to China and demanded the same things, then China might consider moving. But thus far, it has not faced anything resembling a united front. Instead, it's separately faced an American administration determined to take unilateral action to drive change, and EU negotiators who continue to slog through a negotiating process that has dragged on for years. And I do mean years. Now, the US's more aggressive unilateral approach, with which it has pushed harder than anyone else, has cost its companies in the Chinese market. US-based companies have been suffering palpable damage from the trade war as Chinese companies turn from them to, in some cases, their own companies, but very often to multinationals from other parts of the world. And many EU-based companies have seen substantial benefits from this dynamic. Now, if Biden wins, once again, current probability on that 70%, this trend could change, but ultimately it's going to depend on Europe's response. If Europe decides not to align with the US to pressure China in areas of shared interest, EU-based companies will maintain their trade war-driven competitive advantage over US-based companies. If, on the other hand, Europe decides to align with the US to pressure China in areas of shared interest, you can see there are plenty of them. They're listed here on the right-hand side of the slide. Europe-based companies will probably lose their trade war-driven competitive advantage over US-based companies. But in return, you may actually see a change on China's side that would yield an improved competitive environment for all multinationals, regardless of where they're based. Now, there is a caveat here, and it does get a little bit tricky. So on that last point, even if Europe decides to align with the US, it's only going to do that after Washington closes the trust deficit with Brussels that's built up over the last 4 years. And based on our estimates and discussions with our EU-based clients, that's probably going to take at least 12 months from the point when Biden takes office. So EU-based companies can expect to maintain their trade war-driven competitive advantage over US-based companies in China until at least 2022. After that, the nature of the changes will be determined by the EU's response to Biden's outreach. Okay, now that we've spoken about areas in which there's divergence between the two candidates, let's talk about the areas where they're aligned. We'll take the top 3 items in the blue box first, and then move on to the 2 there at the bottom. As you probably noted when reviewing the timeline at the beginning of this session, the US is pushing back on China on a number of different fronts: on the South China Sea, on Xinjiang, on Hong Kong, and on its general military buildup. The US has taken a variety of tangible actions on these fronts, which you can see listed in the central column of this table. And we've outlined additional actions that you can expect to see moving forward in the rightmost column of this table. And once again, we're doing policy analysis here. There's a lot of text involved in that. And so recognizing there's a lot of text in this slide, I'm not going to read through it. I want to instead try to simplify things by highlighting the salient points. The US is going to blacklist additional Chinese companies. In the short term, China is not going to back down in the South China Sea. It's not going to change its policies in Xinjiang. It's not going to change its policies in Hong Kong, and it's certainly not going to stop building up its military. So the US is going to keep on pushing on all of these fronts. Furthermore, China is not going to stand idly by and watch the US blacklist its companies. Now, it's likely to give the US a little space for now so that its actions don't become major points in the upcoming elections. I mean, you can imagine how that would play in the US. Trump would make hay out of that. Actually, Biden might as well. But once the US elections are over, that rationale for forbearance, for holding back, goes away. So looking to the future, looking to next year, heck, even maybe later last year, it's really important that companies prepare for China to begin blacklisting American companies in China. With this in mind, we'd suggest that you take action now if you haven't already. Ensure you have the processes in place required to remain compliant in the face of rapidly changing regulations and to pivot quickly as and when key customers or suppliers are targeted. All right, we addressed the first 3 items in the overlap in that Venn diagram. So let's move on now to the other areas. The other areas where we expect to see a continuation in US policy regardless of who's elected. You'll notice if you look at the left-hand side of the slide that these 2 areas are broader in nature, and they each involve quite a bit of nuance. Admittedly, I've had to oversimplify both points to fit into this table and into the time we have today. They stretch far beyond what you see here. But with that said, I think we can all agree that the US has shown an appetite to drive forward on both of these fronts. This is not to say that the government has been equally successful in taking tangible action in both areas or driving change in both areas. It's gone much further in its attempt to deny China access to key technologies than it has in its attempts to reshore manufacturing. Nevertheless, we expect to see concerted actions on both fronts over the course of the coming years. And while it's difficult to determine exactly what they would look like, we believe that these actions are going to focus on cutting China off from key technologies and controlling production in specific sectors that are designated to be strategically important. Many executives scoff at the idea of decoupling, the notion that politicians would impose the economic pain required to pull production out of China to achieve their political ends. If this is unthinkable for you, consider whether the position in which we find ourselves now was unthinkable for you at the beginning of Mr. Trump's presidency. We believe the US's drive to decouple its economy from China's and secure production in strategically important fields will endure regardless of who is elected. There is serious political will behind this. So with this in mind, we would recommend that you review your product portfolio and your key customers to determine where you are most likely to see disruptions due to regulatory shifts. And in cases where the disruption may be significant, consider how this dynamic could impact your addressable market in China. This dynamic between China, or between the US and China, and indeed in some cases between other countries and China, is creating substantial uncertainty for many multinationals. We saw this actually reflected in a poll that we took earlier this year. You see here a global benchmark, the results of a global benchmarking survey. We took it in July. That included more than 85 senior executives of major multinational companies around the world. Among other questions, we asked how these executives expect to see their supply chain in China change over the next 2 years. We've broken the responses down here out between APAC executives and all global respondents. Some notable differences there. But here's the takeaway. Among global executives, more than 70% responded to this question that they did not know or had not yet made any decisions about how their supply chain in China would evolve over the next 2 years. And even among APAC executives, 50% said the same thing. You'll also note that APAC executives were much more confident in, much more confident that their companies would localize more of their supply chains in China for China. Of course they would. They're very confident in China's potential over the coming years, and why wouldn't their companies take full advantage of that? Global executives, much less confident on that front. Companies are still trying to figure out how to deal with a highly dynamic set of political pressures. Global executives are still trying to determine how their China supply chains will evolve in the face of very challenging or political pressures that are heightened and quite challenging to interpret. So, where does that leave us? Well, it's difficult to say exactly where everything's going to go over the course of the next 2 to 3 years. But we would like to offer you a simple framework to help you begin to think through this situation. One of the things that makes these conversations so hard is the fact that the pressure to decouple is likely to vary substantially across industries and product sets. Furthermore, although there are some areas where companies are almost certainly going to face pressure, there are others where companies are almost certainly going to avoid it. And there's a lot of gray area in the middle. So what we've done here is we've basically laid out a variety of different product sets. Try to be comprehensive, sure that some slip through the gaps here, but basically we laid out a variety of different product sets across different industries, and then basically classified them by the degree to which they're likely to face localization or reshoring pressure. As I mentioned before, sometimes it's, I don't know if I'd say black and white, but sometimes the gray is very, very dark or very, very light, right? So on the right-hand side, you see areas where we expect companies to face substantial political pressure. And by the way, we've labeled here, we've in our subtitle, if you will, focused on the US here. We would say in several of these cases, it's not just the US, it's Europe, it's Japan, it's others. The items on the right, or the product sets on the right, are where we're very likely to see heightened political pressure to localize, or specifically to reshore production. In areas like personal protective equipment, active pharmaceutical ingredients, the COVID epidemic has really drawn attention to gaps there, or to challenges associated with highly fragmented globalized supply chains. Similarly, aerospace and defense equipment, not too much surprise there, and semiconductors. This is a point where we've seen pressure really ramp up, particularly in recent months. On the left-hand side of this slide, you see product sets where politicians probably are not going to put a huge amount of pressure on companies to reshore. I mean, don't get me wrong, the political rhetoric would have you believe that that's going to be the case, and maybe in some cases it will be, But when it comes to textiles and clothing, home furnishings, commoditized inputs like metals and chemicals, the politicians are going to have to pay a really high price to reshore those manufacturing lines. And so they're probably not going to be willing to do that. Challenges in the middle, I mentioned this before. There are a lot of areas where it's really tough to say. There's a lot of gray area for critical infrastructure, like for things like electrical transformers. Where are the vulnerabilities? Communication equipment, same thing. Where are the vulnerabilities? For specialty chemicals and refined metals, how secure is supply? For pharmaceuticals, what is actually essential to manufacture at home? Same thing with med devices and diagnostics. Navigating this gray area and determining how serious politicians are about driving decoupling is going to be critical in determining next steps. Critical. All right. I have a variety of action steps aggregated for this section. We're going to hold those to the end and sum them up for you there. Before we do that, we want to go ahead and talk a little bit about Hong Kong and then engage in some Q&A. Let's talk about the future of Hong Kong. So, when the national security law was passed by Beijing, it was quite a surprise for a lot of companies and a lot of people, actually. Beijing moved faster and more aggressively than many people anticipated. And this has created some concern. And we'll get into why that is, but I wanted to share before we do a survey from AmCham Hong Kong. They've done surveys, you'll see the results of these, really ever since it was passed. So June, July, August, among numerous companies. And just to be clear, these are not just US-based companies. There are a lot of non-US-based companies who are included in AmCham in Hong Kong who are included in this survey. What was notable here was that a lot of companies did express concern. I draw your attention to the very bottom of this chart first. When companies were asked what their or their headquarters' top concerns were about the passing of the security law, and they were given the ability to pick up to 5, almost 90% of companies chose some areas of concern, right? So about 10% of companies said, nope, we're good, no concerns here, right? That's a pretty good indication of the fact that there are substantive considerations in the marketplace right now. If we look at the nature of those considerations, I draw your attention to the top of the chart now. The questions that have arisen have really been about the ambiguity and the scope and enforcement of the law, and what that means specifically for the independence of the judicial system. Because ultimately, these things jeopardize Hong Kong's status as an international business center. They erode the city's autonomy. And don't get me wrong, there are other concerns as well around data security, around retaliatory measures by other governments. Other governments here largely means the US, talent as well. But really the bulk of people are focused on the first 3 items. And that's what we want to talk about. We want to dig into this in a little bit more depth and explain why those are concerns and what's going on. Okay. Let's start with the top line here. The national security law has effectively brought Hong Kong under Chinese law. If we're to sum up in one phrase why this is driving concerns, it is that. You see, prior to the national security law's passage, China and Hong Kong had not just separate legal systems, but separate legal systems operating on different foundational principles, right? Hong Kong had a common law system in which published judicial opinions were held to have primary importance, precedence, right? China, in contrast, has a civil law system in which codified statutes, not precedents, but codified statutes are of primary importance. Now, let me be really clear here. There is Nothing wrong with the civil law system. The majority of countries in the world have civil law systems, not common law systems, right? Japan, Italy, France, a variety of other markets around the world have civil law systems. They work well. They really do. I mean, they trace their origins back to Roman law. Common law system, it's the British system, right? So, the Commonwealth countries and ex-US colonies tend to have that system. They're both equally legitimate and worthwhile systems. But the key here is that they just don't operate in the same way. And what happened with the national security laws passage is that Hong Kong's legal system, i.e. its common law system and all of its precedents, were subordinated to China's legal system, its civil law legal system, and therefore all of its codified statutes under an ill-defined set of circumstances. So under some circumstances that nobody really understands, and I'll get into that in a second, Hong Kong's legal precedents will be ignored in favor of Chinese statutes. Now, this wouldn't be a huge issue if it were super clear exactly where people were going to be judged under Hong Kong law versus Chinese law. But the terms used in the national security law are super murky. Take a look at the red box on this slide, or the maroon box, I should say. Chinese law will be used to judge any acts of secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion. But it's really difficult to determine what those terms mean. They've been pretty clear. Terrorism could include damaging public transportation systems. So if you, spray paint a bus, you could be held to be a terrorist. If you throw something down on the tracks of the MTR, you could be considered a terrorist. Notice I say could be, not will be. We don't know. Secession, subversion. There are serious discussions in the legal community about whether helping or engaging with members of the opposition in Hong Kong will constitute secession or subversion. Similarly, collusion with foreign or external forces. Where do you draw the line? It's talking to a US-based journal or a US journalist or an American journalist, or even a journalist who works for a US company. Is that considered collusion? Nobody knows. And the challenge here is that Beijing ultimately is the one who determines how the national security law is interpreted. No Hong Kong body has the power to do it. So China has complete discretion to determine which cases fall into which systems. This, once again, wouldn't be that much of an issue if the penalties weren't that significant. But the maximum penalty is life in prison. It's not really clear when that would be meted out and when you would see lesser judgments be meted out or lesser sentences be meted out. But I mean, the downside here is pretty big. Additionally, I'd be remiss if I didn't note that some trials can be held behind closed doors, that cases are going to be enforced by a national security commission even when they're held in Hong Kong, and that national security commission is going to be overseen by a Beijing appointed advisor, and that cases can be moved to the mainland whenever China feels like they should be. And by the way, there's extraterritoriality. So the law applies to citizens and non-citizens, residents and non-residents, and it applies regardless of whether those people are doing what they're doing inside or outside of Hong Kong, right? So the terms of this law are super murky and widespread, and the downside risks are big. Okay, you may be saying to yourself, this is all well and good, but I mean, once again, I'm not seeing the linkages. Let me draw out the linkages for you here. In the past, Hong Kong offered a variety of features that made it very attractive for investment. I've laid out 9 of them here. May not be a comprehensive list, depends on the industry. In some industries it's longer, but these 9 items really do feature across industries and really did make Hong Kong attractive in past years. Rule of law was a big one. Everyone in Hong Kong was equal before the law under the same judicial system. Hong Kong residents and visitors, well, largely residents and citizens, but also visitors, were protected. They have freedom of speech, press, publication, association under the basic law. which is basically Hong Kong's mini constitution. Hong Kong was known for low levels of corruption. It was known for ease of doing business. And goodness knows, it's known for its low tax rates. All made it very attractive. The fact that it was close to the Chinese market in terms of physical proximity, as well as cultural proximity. The fact that you had people there who were not just fluent in English, but also Cantonese, and in some cases had long-standing ties to Guangdong. Fantastic. Currency convertibility. The open capital account that Hong Kong has stands in stark contrast to the mainland, and the fact that that opened up plenty of doors for China to tap into international financial markets, and in fact, multinationals to use it as a channel for their FDI into Hong Kong. A lot of multinationals channeled their FDI into China through Hong Kong because they believed that the rule of law provided them, it was called a veil of protection for their investments, believing that if anything happened, they would be protected under Hong Kong law, not Chinese law. It's brilliant. By the way, I'm just going to note this here. Hong Kong does have preferential trading terms, or did have preferential trading terms with a lot of actors, particularly the United States. The US treated Hong Kong as a separate customs territory from China, which which gave it a privileged position. The passage of the national security law has compromised multiple features that I just laid out. I basically marked our rating here on the left-hand side. Hong Kong's not going to raise, it's unlikely to raise its taxes. Low taxes are still going to be a feature of the market. Hong Kong will continue to benefit from its ties to the Pearl River Delta. Nothing's changed there. It will continue to allow currency to flow freely across its borders for reasons I'll get into in a bit. None of that's changed. But for the other stuff, they're serious questions. Let's start at the top. Hong Kong does not have rule of law anymore, period. China does not have rule of law. China has rule of man. It's well documented. It's the difference between 人治 and 法治. When different laws are applied under different judicial systems, you don't have rule of law, particularly when one of those judicial systems, the dominant system, does not operate under the principles of rule of law. Second item, people of Hong Kong no longer have unfettered freedom of speech, publication, press, association. That's gone. That was one of the entire points of the national security laws passage. Regrettably, when you don't have rule of law, it's very difficult to maintain low levels of corruption. There's a pretty solid correlation between the two. So that's drawn that into question. And legal vagaries around this entire situation raise serious questions about ease of doing business in Hong Kong that stretch beyond the individual items that are considered in the World Bank's standard ease of doing business survey. I should also note that while Hong Kong will continue to act as China's window to international financial markets, no doubt about that, fewer multinationals are going to use it as a channel for their FDI into China. Why? Because that veil that I mentioned before is gone. I mean, they know that they don't actually have protection now under Hong Kong law. The veil is lifted. Hong Kong doesn't have rule of law. I'd be remiss if I didn't note that preferential trading terms are going away. The US is rolling back Hong Kong's status as a separate customs territory from China. To be very honest, this is probably not going to be a huge deal for Hong Kong's economy. Having looked over the numbers, run them, it's good for headlines. It's not as big of a deal for the economy writ large, although it may be a big deal for some specific companies who have routed their products through Hong Kong. Definitely something to look at. Okay, so what? What does this mean? Well, I'd highlight three things, right? This is not comprehensive, but all three items are important. Number one, Hong Kong's demographics are set to change. You're going to see fewer expats and a lot more mainland Chinese. This isn't in and of itself a bad thing, but it's important to acknowledge it because it does have implications, particularly if you're a consumer goods company, say a spirits company, this will impact you. But it stretches beyond that. It stretches to the realm of talent management because Singapore and other Asian business hubs are going to benefit. Hong Kong is set to become less welcoming to expats and critically less internationally oriented. So as companies look at different cities as the hubs, as potential hubs for their Asian businesses, Hong Kong is going to drop on that list, which naturally means that other cities are going to rise. Singapore is notable in that group, but it's not alone. There's discussion of Seoul, Tokyo, KL, Bangkok, a variety of different options. I mentioned less internationally oriented. Why? Get into this in a little bit more detail in a moment, but here's the top line view. Hong Kong's focus is going to shift further towards serving mainland China, especially the Greater Bay Area. I'll show you what that looks like in a bit, but basically it's the Pearl River Delta. Hong Kong is set to become more like other Chinese cities, much more like other Chinese cities. Its main differentiators will be its tax regime, its capital markets, and its currency regime. All right, let's talk about this in a little bit more depth. Hong Kong's demographics are set to change. Right? Take a look at the chart on the left-hand side of this slide. These are Hong Kong work visa applications, excluding mainland Chinese, okay? Excuse me, and it's, to be specific, it's the growth in those applications, not the absolute number. And notably, this is fiscal year data. So that 2020 number is a number through the growth rate through March of 2020. So this actually doesn't really reflect the deep impact of COVID-19. If you were, I imagine next year's numbers are going to look dramatically worse because that's really where we're going to see the impact of COVID-19 come through. The number of Hong Kong work visa applications by non-mainland Chinese citizens has been nosediving for the last couple of years. Actually, well, we'll just say the last year, and is likely to continue doing so this year. Particularly because of the national security law. Not exclusively, but it's going to be accelerated because of the national security law. So I mentioned those AmCham survey results. Take a look at the chart on the right-hand side of the screen. There you see the survey results for June, July, and August mapped out. AmCham asked, in light of the national security law, will you personally consider leaving Hong Kong? And you'll see that the percent of respondents who said yes rose pretty substantially over the course of the last couple of months, to the point now where more than half have said yes. There's a very important caveat here. The majority of people who said yes in the medium to long term, not in the short term, okay? So we are not suggesting here that there's going to be a massive outflow of expats in the next couple of months. It's not gonna happen, or at least we don't expect it to happen. It could, but it's unlikely. This is instead indicative of a longer term trend. We don't think it's going to take 5 to 10 years, but it's also not going to happen over the next 3 months. Okay, so Hong Kong's demographics are set to change. You may say to yourself, well, that's fine. And those are the people, not the companies. Brings us to our next point. A similar survey was asked in those by AmCham, or excuse me, a similar question was asked in those AmCham surveys that I mentioned. It focused on companies instead of people. The question was, in light of the national security law, will your company consider moving capital assets, business operations out of Hong Kong? Once again, we see a similar trend. Now here, not as many people are saying, or not as many companies are likely or are responding positively to this question. More people are considering leaving than they would say companies. But the trend is nevertheless clear, and the numbers are worryingly high. Basically, 40% of respondents said yes, their company would consider moving capital assets, business operations out of Hong Kong as a result of the national security law. Once again, key caveat, this is over the medium to long term, not over the short term. But this is still an indication that as Hong Kong becomes less welcoming to expats and less internationally oriented, other Asian hubs are going to benefit, right? The capital, the assets, the business operations need to go somewhere. They're probably not going to go all the way back home for US and European-based companies. All right, I keep on talking about Hong Kong being less internationally oriented. Why do I say that? Well, China has basically published a strategic plan for the Greater Bay Area. I mentioned that before, that outlines what's going to happen to Hong Kong in pretty clear detail. Take a look at the map on the left-hand side of the slide. There you see the Greater Bay Area charted out. This is basically, as I mentioned before, the Pearl River Delta. Traditionally a very prosperous, export-oriented manufacturing powerhouse in China that extends well beyond Hong Kong, obviously, and includes some really impressive urban areas like Shenzhen, for example. China's goal here is to integrate Hong Kong into the Pearl River Delta, into the Greater Bay Area. One might say, basically remove the divides that were put in place when China handed Hong Kong over to Britain following the Opium Wars, right? This is part of a much longer term push for China to redress so many of the wrongs it felt it suffered during the so-called Century of Humiliation. Right? This Greater Bay Area National Strategic Plan is real. It is tied up in issues of national pride, and frankly speaking, I mean, it's a pretty solid plan. It means in aggregate that Hong Kong's focus is going to shift further towards serving mainland China, towards integrating with these different parts of the Greater Bay Area. And in doing so, it's going to become a lot more like other Chinese cities. Now, to be clear, we're not saying that it's just going to become like all the other Chinese cities in its entirety. It's not, because actually Hong Kong has a very special role to play in China's vision for its future. So we basically laid out in these three check boxes China's vision as we see it for the future of Hong Kong. These are tied to broader goals that China has. So let me just go down and provide some commentary. First and foremost, China wants to lower barriers and loosen bottlenecks so that investment, trade, talent can flow freely, particularly from Hong Kong to mainland China, to a lesser degree back, although that will happen over time. Once again, integration between Hong Kong and the rest of the Greater Bay Area. They're building transportation links, they're building financial links, they're trying to find any and all reasons that businesses struggle to do or to conduct business, or companies can struggle to conduct business across borders. China, though, wants to make sure that Hong Kong is separate because the city maintains unparalleled links to international markets. And that's important for China because it allows its companies, particularly in the Greater Bay Area, but more broadly as well, to access reasonably priced capital internationally. This is important because it allows China to develop its national champions, and it does not want to give that up. Hong Kong will remain China's window to the world in terms of financial markets. And that's particularly true with regards to the renminbi. China will elevate Hong Kong's status as the global center for, or maintain, I guess I should say, Hong Kong's status as the global center for offshore renminbi trade and utilize it long-term to advance its goal of internationalizing the currency. This is a long-term goal. So we're not saying things are going to change overnight, but what it also means is that Hong Kong's currency regime is probably going to remain intact long-term. It's a critical plank in China's broader policy priorities. Okay, so once again, we'll sum all this up in some actions to take after the Q&A, but wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity to address some questions. So I'd like to go ahead and move on to the Q&A portion, and then I'll go ahead and sum up the first and the second sections with some actions to take. I want to make sure that I leave you with some pretty clear action items. So once again, if you have any questions, please share them with us via the GoToMeeting Messenger by sending them to DuckerFrontier webinars. Megan is going to be handling questions. She's been sending me some over the course of this discussion thus far. Let's go ahead and dive in. So first question, AmCham Shanghai released a survey this week suggesting that US companies are not moving away from China despite the Trump administration's best efforts. You suggest that that might look a little different in the future. Why would the future look any different? That's a good question, actually. I mean, look, companies don't want to move away from China. The domestic market is huge. And particularly if you look around the world, China's the only major market that's set to grow this year and over the course of the coming years. It seems to have handled COVID well. There seems to be a lot of opportunity there. And a lot of senior executives are looking at their P&L and wondering how the heck they're going to meet their targets. China looks pretty freaking good right now. Here's the problem, though. The political climate has shifted dramatically, particularly in the US, but not just in the US. You see it actually reflected in Europe as well, and some recent statements that have come out. Once again, even this week, the European Chamber of Commerce is basically released. The European prominent European business organizations in China released a major policy paper, and their tones become a lot more strident too. Politicians are beginning to show more willingness to impose pain abroad to address concerns at home. Yes, in Asia, among executives who are based here, there's great confidence about the future of China. They see so much potential there to meet their revenue and profitability targets. But their confidence is not necessarily reflected in headquarters. You know, I spoke with one executive in the run-up to a virtual executive roundtable that we held here on Wednesday on the same topic, and he said something that stuck with me. He said, you know, I see plenty of opportunities for investment, but I hear so much reticence when I speak with my boss, with my colleagues back in headquarters. There's also it used to be yes, now it's yes, but. It used to be, I hear you, and now it's I hear you, however. We're not saying that companies are going to pull wholesale out of China, but we're also saying that it would be wise to consider that the trajectory that we have all been on for the last couple of decades, few decades in some cases, may be changing. It's really important that we not get caught out by a failure of our collective imaginations. You know, think back to the beginning of the Trump administration. I mentioned this before. How many of us believe that we would end up in the situation that we're in now with regards to tariffs, with regards to amped up tensions between the US and Chinese government? Back to the beginning of COVID, at the beginning of this year, how many of us believed that we would end up in the situation that we're in now with the global pandemic? Don't get caught up by a failure of your imaginations. All right, second question. How aggressively do you think Beijing will be in how aggressive do you think Beijing will be in implementing the national security law? That is the $1 million question, isn't it? It's tough to say. Look, if I were Xi Jinping, I'd be careful. Okay, I would be very careful because this really does have the potential to change things in Hong Kong short term. I mentioned before, these AmCham opinion surveys, they're a pretty good reflection, I would argue, of much of the sentiment that we're hearing from companies there. Look, I don't want to overplay it. There are plenty of executives who've told me, look, I have no intention of moving, and I don't hear about nearly as many concerns by my network. But equally, I've spoken with several who say that their friends are freaking out and they know several people are moving. The degree to which you see people moving from the first bucket to the second bucket, the degree to which you see people who are planning to leave longer term start shifting their plans forward, the degree to which you see companies do the same thing, the degree to which you see people and companies who are not thinking about leaving start to seriously consider will depend to a large degree on how aggressive Beijing is in implementing the national security law. And that's why I say I'd be careful. But here's the thing. We're seeing saber rattling on the Sino-Indian border. We're seeing wolf warrior diplomacy in Europe. And ultimately, the Chinese Communist Party's leadership considers Hong Kong to be China's internal affair, by God. And it has a plan for the city's future, a relatively robust plan for the city's future already laid out. So Mr. Xi may feel like he can do what he likes on the Hong Kong front. Thank you very much. So, well, I wouldn't expect really aggressive implementation as my base case. I'm not meaning to suggest that that's going to happen. I would consider it a strong downside risk. And you'll see that reflected in one of the actions that we suggest taking in just a minute or two. All right, I know we're a little bit past the top of the hour here. I'm going to just address, I think, one more question, and then we'll move on to actions to take and wrap up for today. Last question. Which city or cities do you think will benefit most from Hong Kong's decline as an international business hub? This is a tough one, and I think it varies substantially by industry. I mean, look, we see media companies pulling people out already, moving to places like Seoul, Tokyo. But with that being said, if we look across the companies that we serve and think about what we've heard from our executives, I mean, Singapore seems like a natural choice. I mean, we've actually seen it within our companies. A whole lot of people have been moving into Singapore. And I have friends who are too, although in fairness, not all that's coming out of Hong Kong. Some people are just moving out of Hong Kong and being replaced by other individuals who are moving here. With that being said, though, it'll depend on how Singapore's policies change over time. Ministry of Manpower's policies have definitely been in flux recently, and there are some open questions about the degree to which that will influence companies' ability to get senior expat talent in. We'll see. We'll see. At this point, though, I'd say Singapore probably is in pole position relative to other hubs. With that said, there are other cities that may actually see some interest. I mentioned Seoul already. There may be some companies that say, hey, you know what, if I'm gonna be in China, I might as well be in China. So we may see some companies even look at Shanghai instead of Hong Kong. If the two aren't really gonna be that different, why not be closer to the Yangtze River Delta? Some companies may think that. There are some black sheep, not black sheep, I'm sorry. There are some cities that have flown under the radar, but may also see some interest. KL is actually one of them. Believe it or not, we have seen some major industrial companies look seriously at KL and even move some of their operations there based on the benefits that have been provided. We'll see how things go with the political situation there, but it's another area where we have heard a little bit of buzz. But if I were to take a step back, say Singapore's in pole position, and to benefit from this, it's really just going to depend on how the Singaporean government decides to manage the situation. All right, I know we're well past time, so let me just go ahead and leave you today with some actions to take. With that being said, I know there were some additional questions that came through. If we were unable to answer the question on the line today, we will be sure to follow up with our responses through your relationship manager. Okay, let's go ahead and finish this webinar by highlighting several actions to take. These are actions that we outlined throughout the session, but wanted to bring them together here. Number one, plan for US-China tensions to continue rising regardless of who wins the US presidency. The recent election that we've seen is not simply a function of the US election. It is, the recent escalation that we've seen is not a function of the US election. It is consistent with ongoing longer-term trends. Number two, expect EU-based companies in China to maintain their trade war-driven competitive advantage over US-based companies through at least the end of next year. After that, their advantage may deteriorate. It won't if Mr. Trump is elected. It may if Mr. Biden is elected. But then it will depend on Europe and its willingness to align with the US. Number three, Washington's going to blacklist additional Chinese companies. Beijing's probably going to start blacklisting some American companies in retaliation. Make sure you have the processes in place required to remain compliant in the face of those moves. And finally, the US in particular, but others as well, are likely to move to decouple its economy, their economies, from China's and secure production strategic industries. Review your product portfolio and your key customers to determine where you are most likely to see disruptions from those moves. Those are actions to take with regards to the US and China. With regards to Hong Kong, 4 additional actions to take. If you have operations in the city-state, or now actually city, evaluate your company's potential exposure under the national security law and do it under a narrow and a broad reading of the law. Because as I mentioned, we don't know how Beijing is going to implement it. Move quickly to mitigate any critical risks surfaced by this evaluation, and that includes a broad reading. Number 2, Hong Kong's demographics are going to change. You're going to see fewer expats and more mainland Chinese. So prepare yourself for that. If you're a consumer goods company, think about what that may mean for your product portfolio, for your positioning, for your marketing. But also, if you have operations in Hong Kong, expect more difficulties in hiring and attracting non-Chinese talent for postings there. Although, actually, the flip side of that is expect less difficulties hiring Chinese talent there. Prepare for more multinational investment and more talent. Definitely expats, maybe Hong Kongers actually, to flow from Hong Kong to other Asian business hubs. If you're on the hunt for talent and you feel like you can get that talent into your chosen business hub, now would be a good time to go hunting. Finally, prepare for Hong Kong to become much more like other Chinese cities. Its main and maybe even only points of differentiation over the medium to long term are likely to be its low tax rates, heavy focus on international financial services, and separate currency regime. All right, thank you for bearing with us. I know we've gone a bit over, but hopefully it's been worth it. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to go ahead and conclude our webinar here for today. We look forward to speaking with you again soon. Thank you.